The day I took my pregnancy test, I couldn't contain my excitement. I wanted to surprise James with the news that we'd soon be parents. I quietly headed to his office, imagining his happiness when he found out. But as I pushed open his office door, I froze. There he was, holding and kissing his secretary, a woman I didn't know but would never forget noticing me standing there. The secretary smirked and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Aren't you afraid the wife at home will get jealous?" James snickered, pulling her closer, his voice dripping with arrogance. "She? Jealous?" he sneered. "As far as I'm concerned, you're the only one who deserves the title of wife. She's just a pitiful stray I keep around, nothing more than a pet." The words struck me like a physical blow. Holding back the tidal wave of pain, I left his office silently, feeling as though my heart was in pieces. When I got home, I started packing, determined to leave and go far away. That night, as I was folding my clothes into a suitcase, James finally came home. He noticed what I was doing and, without a word, yanked an old jacket from my hands, tossing it into the trash with utter disdain. "I told you to get rid of this junk ages ago," he spat. "Just seeing it here disgusts me." Earlier, he'd spoken of me as nothing more than a pet, and now, he treated the few things I cherished like trash. My chest ached, my face turned pale, but I fought to keep my expression calm. He didn't even look at me as he tossed a small, lavishly wrapped box onto the bed. "It's your birthday, isn't it?" His tone was almost mocking. "I had a custom piece made. Do me a favor and start dressing like you belong here. I can't have my wife looking like a disgrace." I opened the box and found a pair of gemstone-studded earrings. They were exquisite, yet cold, and they felt like they belonged to a stranger. I placed the box gently on the table, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, but there's no need. My birthday already passed." James glanced at the clock, his patience fraying. "It's barely 5 minutes past midnight," he snapped, irritation coloring his words. "What's wrong with you, Nadine? Are you just trying to start a fight?" Taking a deep breath, I tried to explain as calmly as I could, "I'm not trying to pick a fight." Ignoring his scornful gaze, I crouched down to retrieve the clothes he'd thrown aside. "These clothes are precious to me. The headmistress of my orphanage gave them to me when I left. They're clean, not garbage." As I spoke, memories flooded my mind. The day we met, me in these clothes, him looking at me like I was his whole world. 7 years ago, when I left the orphanage and moved to this big city to study, I met James. I was working part-time in a restaurant when he first saw me, and from that moment, he pursued me relentlessly. I was an orphan, unaccustomed to affection, and I fell for him so quickly, so completely. Eventually, I learned that he was the heir to the Hunter Corporation. He came from a life I'd never even dreamed of, surrounded by wealth and luxury, and women constantly vying for his attention. But when he brought me home, he assured me that he'd left that life behind. He'd chosen me, and I foolishly believed I was his forever. So, on my birthday, when the doctor told me I was pregnant, I couldn't wait to share the news. I rushed to his office, eager to tell him, only to find that, rejecting my gift for this old junk. "And you say you're not trying to start something?" James scoffed, his eyes cold as he watched me fold the clothes. His smirk grew crueler. "Nadine, have I given you too much freedom lately?" He grabbed my arm with one swift, unfeeling motion, pulling me so roughly that I stumbled, slamming into the corner of the table. Pain tore through my abdomen, and my heart raced with terror as I cradled my stomach, instinctively shielding the tiny life inside me. My voice trembled as I whispered, "I don't have my ears pierced. I can't wear earrings." James' face twisted in irritation. He released me, his eyes flashing as he studied my reaction. For a brief second, he looked almost taken aback. I forced myself to ignore the pain, stepping away from him as calmly as I could. He glanced at my stomach with barely concealed distaste. "Maybe it wouldn't hurt you to start working out more. You've let yourself go, Nadine. I don't want to see you outshined by other women." I bit my lip, fighting the sting of his words, but he turned his back on me without waiting for a reply, shutting the bedroom door with a slam. Left alone, I pressed my hand against my abdomen, whispering through silent tears, "I'm so sorry, little one. Your father has changed, and now I can't have you." As the house fell silent, my mind drifted back to the scene in his office. 7 years of love, 7 years of misplaced trust. When he finally quieted down, I walked towards the bedroom, hoping for some final words, some closure, but I stopped short. Through the door, I heard James' voice, light and almost gleeful, as he murmured into the phone, "Don't worry about the earrings. She can throw them away if she likes. When I marry you, I'll buy you jewelry 100 times better." My heart shattered for the final time. I picked up my suitcase and looked around, knowing this was goodbye. And with my heart in pieces, I left the house that held all our memories, stepping into the night alone. 5 days had passed since I walked out of James's life, carrying only the essentials and the shattered pieces of my heart. On the 5th day, my phone rang. His name appeared on the screen, stirring a rush of emotions within me. I wondered if he would ask why I had been gone so long, if he'd finally noticed I wasn't there. But his tone was cool, almost indifferent. "Hey, where did you put the silk tie I bought last month?" I closed my eyes, clenching the phone, but I still managed to tell him exactly where he'd left it, word for word. Once he found it, he continued without so much as a pause, "Don't stay wherever you are. Book the earliest flight back and don't forget to attend the charity banquet tonight." I couldn't stop the humorless laugh that slipped out, cold and sharp. After disappearing for 5 days, he assumed I was merely traveling. How blind I'd been to waste my youth on a man like this, a man who didn't even notice his wife had left. Sitting on the steps outside the maternity clinic, I looked down at the appointment slip in my hand, an abortion scheduled for today. My fingers trembled as I replied, "I won't be back." "Why don't you ask Sandra to be your date?" Sandra Wilson, his secretary and the daughter of a wealthy family. She'd attached herself to him after he'd, heroically, saved her from a minor car accident, worming her way into his life, from a lowly assistant to his personal secretary, and finally into his bed. It was old gossip at his office, and yet I had chosen to stay blind, to believe he loved only me. Until that day in his office shattered everything. Silence stretched between us for a moment before James's voice filled with anger. "Nadine, what's gotten into you? Sandra is my secretary, not some slave for you to boss around. When did you become so bitter? It's just a simple matter, can't you just cooperate with me?" The way he spoke her name, so soft and gentle, a stark contrast to the way he spat out mine, it cut deeply. I bit down on my lip, swallowing the tears that threatened to spill. The nurse's voice called my number, and more out of a desire to escape the phone call than anything else, I ended the call without another word. It had been his routine for years. If he wanted me to bend to his will, he'd needle at my insecurities, remind me of my past, an orphan with no family to protect me. He'd keep at it, relentless, until I caved, breaking down in helpless tears, and finally I would submit. But this time, he couldn't break me. After 5 missed calls, he gave up. As I lay on the cold operating table, staring at the sterile instruments above me, a wave of nausea hit. I felt a faint, almost imperceptible movement from within our baby, so fragile and vulnerable. It felt like they were pleading with me, asking me to protect them. I squeezed my eyes shut, memories of James's betrayal flashing before me, but I couldn't go through with it. I sat up, told the doctor I couldn't go through with it, and left, my decision final. After gathering myself, I called James, ready to tell him everything, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would finally listen. But he barely let me speak before he launched into a tirade. "You vindictive woman. Who gave you the right to harass Sandra?" I was stunned, completely lost. "What are you talking about? Oh, don't play innocent with me. You refused to come to the banquet, and then you go behind my back, threatened Sandra not to go, and even assaulted her." I could hear the pure venom in his voice as he sneered, "Sandra never did anything to you. After 7 years, Nadine, I'm finally seeing who you truly are, a vile, spiteful woman." The accusation left me numb. He didn't give me a chance to explain, dismissing every word I tried to say. After hanging up, I stumbled out of the clinic, barely noticing the rain that had started to fall, cold drops mixed with my tears, blurring my vision. Through the haze, I noticed a sleek black car pull up at the curb, a Maybach. I recognized it immediately and froze. As if in a daze, I watched as James got out and walked toward me, his face contorted with anger. Before I could say anything, he raised his hand and slapped me, the sting searing across my cheek. "Dare you pretend to be traveling?" he spat, fury evident in every word. I barely felt the physical pain, though. My mind was spinning as I asked, horrified, Did you put a track on me?" His silence was my answer. He grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the car without another word. So much for protecting Sandra's freedom, he thought nothing of invading mine. And yet, during the entire 5 days I was gone, he hadn't even checked the tracker. Not once. Only when he believed I'd caused trouble for Sandra did he bother to look. How twisted, how laughably cruel. When we returned to the house, he locked me in the dark, empty storage room on the 2nd floor, saying he wouldn't let me out until I apologized willingly. To Sandra, left alone in the darkness, I felt waves of nausea and trembling hit me again. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps outside the door, and I recognized Sandra's shrill, mocking laughter. "Oh, James," she purred, her voice almost giddy, "why did you have to lock her up here? Couldn't we just ignore her?" "After all," he replied softly, his voice barely a murmur but dripping with contempt, "she's nothing more than a stray, a nuisance." Outside the door, they exchanged murmurs of affection, their voices intertwining. My stomach twisted painfully as I sank against the wall, gripping my knees to my chest. It felt as though they were tearing me apart from the inside, bit by bit. "Do you have a cat, James?" Sandra giggled, just outside the door. "I keep hearing scratching and rattling." Without missing a beat, he replied, "No cat, probably just a filthy rat causing trouble." Then, in a quieter voice, he said, "Sandra, the dinner's about to start. Let's head out." I thought they were finally gone when a sudden flood of light hit my face. I shielded my eyes and looked up, find Sandra standing over me, a satisfied smirk on her face. Well, Nadine," she purred, "so this is where you've been hiding." Sandra held a twisted kind of power over me. She had tracked down the orphanage director, the woman who'd raised me, and blackmailed her. It was Sandra's way of ensuring I couldn't tell James the truth, that I'd never laid a hand on her. She was shrewd, and she knew that, as long as I remained silent under the weight of these false accusations, James would only grow to resent me more. And she was right. Through the muffled chatter of the housemaids outside my locked storage room, I learned that James had introduced Sandra as his girlfriend at the dinner party, erasing any mention of me, his wife. As the servants gossiped, I overheard that he had even gone so far as to cut off my food and water, all in the name of Sandra's honor. 3 days I had been locked in this cold, cramped space. My phone was gone, tossed out by James, and my luggage had been confiscated. When he found my visa and flight ticket, scheduled for a week later, his fury intensified. He stormed in, opening the door with a glare that could freeze fire. "You were planning to run, huh?" His voice was sharp with accusation. "After everything you've done, Nadine, you thought you could just disappear." Weak from hunger, I could barely register his words, the room spinning around me in blurred shadows. It took me a moment to respond, but he took my silence as defiance, his gaze growing colder. He sneered, still playing the victim. "Fine, you're going to serve Sandra until she forgives you." I raised my head slowly, disbelief clouding my vision. The man before me, once my world, was now a stranger, as indifferent as a passing shadow. The baby kicked gently, as if sensing my pain, and I felt tears prickling my eyes, swallowing them back. I forced myself to say, barely a whisper, "I can't. I'm too," but James didn't give me a chance to finish. He dragged me out of the storage room and pushed me toward Sandra. She greeted him with a satisfied smile, pleased with the spectacle. With a calculated sweetness, Sandra leaned closer, her polished nails glinting in the light. "Nadine, could you be a dear and help me change my shoes?" She lifted one foot, wiggling her toes near my face. "James, look, she's hardly moving. She looks at me like I'm her enemy." James smirked, dismissing me with a glance. "She's just putting on an act. Ignore her." My legs trembled with each step, and every breath was a battle against the hunger and exhaustion weighing me down. James's sneer only made the ache in my chest deeper, colder. His words felt like shards of ice, reminding me of how far he had drifted from me. Sandra tilted her head, smiling innocently. "Oh, James, do you see how she looks at me? Like she wants to bite my head off." With every new complaint, James's gaze darkened, his disdain for me growing more evident. Sandra kept me busy for over half an hour, ordering me to search for a non-existent document she claimed to have misplaced somewhere in the villa. My feet stumbled up and down the stairs, my body running on pure willpower as I searched every room, my energy draining with each step. Finally, after what felt like hours, she waved a hand. "Oh, I must have remembered wrong," she sighed, feigning sympathy. "Sorry, Nadine. I hope you didn't tire yourself too much." A faint flicker of relief washed over me, and I turned, desperate for the kitchen, desperate for a moment to gather myself. But the relief was short-lived. In the next second, James's hand clamped down on my shoulder, his grip painfully tight. "I told you, Nadine," he said coldly. "You're going to apologize to Sandra. And I mean on your knees." I stared up at him, shock and anger mingling in my chest. I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I? The memory of Sandra's blackmail stopped me mid-sentence. Her threats against the orphanage director echoed in my mind, silencing my protest. James's grip tightened, and I felt his contempt pressing down on me, suffocating me. I was caught, torn between loyalty and despair. On one side was the orphanage director, who had raised me like her own. On the other was this false accusation that held me captive. My fists clenched, my nails biting into my palms. Anger and helplessness churned within me, but I could only kneel, defeated. A bitter smile twisted my lips as I looked up at him. Fine, I was wrong. The words tasted like poison, but as I tried to force them out, a sharp, nauseating pain gripped me. My body convulsed, and I felt a stabbing ache in my lower abdomen. The world blurred, and just before everything faded to black, I saw the horrified look in James's eyes. When I finally woke, I was in a bed, surrounded by the sterile, white light of a doctor's examination room. A young doctor hovered nearby, her face drawn with concern. She glanced toward James, who stood beside her, visibly agitated. "What's wrong with her?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of confusion and worry. The doctor hesitated before answering, her voice heavy. "Mr. Graham, she's extremely weak, both from physical strain and the severe distress she's been under." I'm afraid she's had a miscarriage. Chapter for James stood frozen, as if struck by lightning, his face pale with shock. His eyes searched mine, filled with disbelief. You re-pregnant, he stammered. You were carrying our child. I rested a hand over my stomach, feeling the emptiness where a vibrant life had once been. The pain clawed at my heart, twisting and gnawing. Yes, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. I was 3 months pregnant. I closed my eyes, unwilling to look at the man who had indirectly ended our child's life. But he wouldn't let it rest. His questions kept coming, his disbelief clear. He demanded talk after for know why I hadn't told him about the pregnancy. I shook my head. I had tried to tell him countless times. But every attempt was silenced by his anger, his accusations, his scorn. Now, it was too late. Nothing he could say or ask would bring back the child we had lost. He repeated the question, frustration evident in his voice. Finally, I couldn't help but look up, meeting his gaze with a bitter smile. Why do you care now, James? Isn't your heart only for Sandra? Why put on this show of caring? His face tightened and he seemed taken aback. For a moment, he looked at me like he was struggling to find an answer. After a long chapter for silence, he finally managed, no, it's not like that. His weak response fell flat, stirring nothing in me. My heart had been shattered too many times to find comfort in words now. I asked him to leave, requesting that he and the doctor give me time alone to come to terms with everything. In the days that followed, I said nothing. The silence was my shield, a layer of calm over the storm of hurt raging within. But after a week, James sought me out again, a strained smile on his face. He told me he had bought a private island. You were trying to leave the country for a break, right? I can give you something better, he said, his voice surprisingly soft. The island is yours. I've arranged for a chapter for private jet too. Just say the word, and you can go whenever you want. The humility in his tone was startling, a stark contrast to the cold, unfeeling man he had become. It was almost hard to believe that this was the same James who had once been a symbol of confidence, the prince, who always got his way. Seeing him now, I remembered the rumors I'd heard when we first met, the ones that had painted him as a heartless playboy who'd never settled down for anyone. Yet I, foolishly, had believed I was different. He must have sensed my thoughts because he reached for my hand, his face weary. Nadine, please, I just want to make things right, he murmured. Just smile again, even just once. Chapter 4. I pulled my hand away, looking at him with a mix of sorrow and pity. James, I don't need an island and I certainly don't need a jet, I said, my voice tired but resolute. I don't want to be bought. I still have my self-respect. His face twisted, pained, and he fumbled for words. I wanted to make things better. I never meant for you to feel this way. His hand reached for mine again, trembling, as though desperate to hold on to the past. But my mind drifted back to that awful moment, to the cold look in his eyes as he forced me to kneel and apologize to Sandra. That was the moment everything inside me had died. Chapter 4. Seeing my lack of response, he tried again. The doctor said you refusing to eat, he pleaded softly. She mentioned you wouldn't even allow the nutritional shots. I thought maybe these gifts would cheer you up. I let out a shaky breath, my tone laced with bitterness. Funny, isn't it? When you locked me in that storage room for 2 days without food or water, it was to punish me. Well, congratulations. I've lost my appetite. He looked genuinely taken aback, his expression softening. I ordered the nanny to bring you food. I didn't know she 39. I cut him off, anger boiling over. Didn't Chapter 4 know? I echoed, my voice rising. If I told you Sandra had bribed her to keep me starving, would you even believe me? He faltered, his eyes averting mine. I let out a small, hollow laugh, knowing that he couldn't answer. This was the man who once claimed to love me, yet he couldn't even acknowledge the depth of Sandra's malice. He took a hesitant step closer, a hint of desperation in his voice. Nadine, please. How can I make this right? Just tell me. I'd move mountains if that's what it takes. My gaze lingered on him, but I no longer saw the man I had fallen for. Whatever he said, whatever promises he made, the past couldn't be erased. Chapter 4. His voice softened, almost pleading. I had wanted a child with you, Nadine, more than you'll ever know. Maybe this one came at the wrong time, but that doesn't mean we won't have others. He smiled faintly, as if envisioning a future that could erase the horrors of the past. We'll try again. And I swear, I'll give our future children the best of everything. But I couldn't hear it anymore. I had nothing left to give to a man who'd once meant everything but had broken me beyond repair. A sad, tired resolve washed over me and I lowered my gaze. Let me go, James, I whispered, my voice barely audible. We redone. I'll live my life, but I don't ever want to see you again. Chapter 5. James refused to let me go. Every day, he found excuses to be near me. He'd show up at odd hours, sit on the sofa in my room at night, and insist on keeping watch, as if his presence were some kind of balm for my wounds. I spent those hours seething silently, ignoring him whenever I could. But he was relentless, always patient, always watching. It wasn't touching. Not at all. If anything, his constant presence made me sick to my core. How dare he act affectionate now, after tormenting me to the edge of despair? It was a grotesque show of hypocrisy. I was too weak to argue. At first the grief had chapter 5 drained me. I ate so little, refused the nutritional shots, and my health declined quickly. The doctor on standby attended to me day and night, and James responded by increasing the villa's security. Every time he left for work, he left 2 guards stationed outside my bedroom door, as if I were some kind of prisoner. After a week of this confinement, I finally snapped. The moment he walked in from a long day at work, looking weary but expectant, I forced myself up, bracing my shaky body, and confronted him. "Can you stop guarding me like I'm some kind of criminal?" I demanded, my voice trembling with frustration. He looked taken aback, clearly not expecting chapter 5 this kind of reception. His brows furrowed, the faintest sign of irritation breaking through his mask of calm. But I was past caring. If he was angry, maybe, just maybe, he'd finally set me free. Instead, his expression softened the instant he realized it was me standing there. "Nadine," he said gently, reaching out to steady me, a trace of genuine concern in his voice. "You should have put on a jacket before coming downstairs. Still recovering?" I jerked my arm from his grasp. "I'm fine," I replied coldly. Ignoring my tone, he waved a hand, and a line of servants entered, each one carrying boxes of my favorite desserts. "I brought your favorite taro pastries," he said, as though chapter 5 nothing had changed. "Won't you try them?" It looked like he hadn't just bought a few pastries, he'd practically brought the whole bakery home with him. I turned away, resisting the urge to throw every last box on the floor. He was insistent, going to extremes, and yet, nothing could make up for the pain he'd caused. From that day on, I found little ways to make his life difficult. I ignored his gestures, knocked over his carefully chosen gifts, or broke the hand-crafted ornaments he brought to apologize. Day by day, his patience wore thin. Finally, after I had thrown his 26th apology gift in the trash, he snapped. His voice, sharp and raw, echoed through the room. "What on earth will it take to make chapter 5 you happy, Nadine?" For a fleeting moment, the fire in his voice made me falter. But I stood my ground, drawing a deep breath and speaking with all the strength I could muster. "I've only ever wanted one thing from you, James, just let me go." A shadow passed over his face as he shook his head, his jaw set stubbornly. I picked up the shattered gift from the floor, tempted to throw it away again, just to remind him how little his so-called apologies meant to me. He must have misinterpreted my intentions, though, because in one sudden, panicked motion, he slapped the object from my hand. The force knocked me backward and I stumbled, hitting my forehead against the sharp corner of the table. Chapter 5. The pain shot through me, blinding and sharp, and for a second, everything blurred. My private doctor rushed in, tending to my injuries as James stood by, his face stricken with something close to horror. But remorse was a poor substitute for the agony he'd caused. The next day, he stayed home from work, hovering around me as if that would somehow make a difference. To my disgust, Sandra even showed up at the villa unannounced. I forced myself to endure her presence, responding to her greetings with the barest nods. She, however, seemed unfazed, smiling as if nothing were amiss. After some pleasantries, she reached into her bag, producing a small, ornate invitation, which she extended to me. Chapter 5. Nadine, she said in her usual sugary tone, "James and I are getting married at the end of next month. You should recover and come celebrate with us." I blinked, certain I hadn't heard her right. Seeing my confusion, she repeated herself, her voice soft and light, before leaning into James, her hand resting on his shoulder. My stomach churned. All the while James had been professing his devotion to me, his plans with Sandra had clearly been moving forward. The very same man who had promised we'd start a family again, was here, silent, a mere accessory to Sandra's brazen announcement. Summoning all my strength, I forced myself to respond, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. "Sure," I said coldly. "I'll be there." Chapter 5. That night, Sandra stayed over, her laughter ringing through the halls as if she were the true lady of the house. When I noticed that the guards outside my bedroom door had left their posts, no doubt distracted by Sandra and James, I seized the chance. I gathered what little I needed, slipped out, and under the cover of night, I fled from the villa. I felt the chill of the night air as I left everything I'd ever known behind. Chapter 6. Afraid that James had planted a tracker on me, I took every precaution. On the night I fled, I carried only my ID, some cash, and nothing else that could lead him to me. I bought new clothes, ditched my old phone, and replaced it with a burner. Still, I see chapter 6 couldn't shake the feeling that his reach extended farther than I could imagine. The next day, I went to the bank to check on my accounts. To my shock, there was an astronomical balance in my account, $1 million. My hands shook as I scrolled through the transaction history, piecing together the bizarre truth. Every year, on my birthday, James had transferred $1 million from his private account to mine, an accumulation over the 7 years we'd been together. My breath caught as I processed the numbers, but I knew what I had to do. With a final, decisive sigh, I left online some I'd earned myself over the years. The rest, every cent of James's money, I donated anonymously to orphanages across the chapter 6 country. It was my way of cutting the last threads connecting me to him. For now, I was determined to disappear completely. I rode the train until the cityscape faded into rolling green hills and distant mountains, finally arriving at a small, sleepy town nestled far from the life I'd known. I rented a modest cottage with a small courtyard, where I grew flowers and plants, letting each day pass in a peaceful, unremarkable rhythm. I shopped at the local market, found work with simple handicrafts, and gradually restored some semblance of peace in my life. After leaving James, I started to feel like myself again. I ate, I slept. My spirit slowly mended, as did my will to live without the constant weight of his shadow. Chapter 6. Then, one evening, I received a phone call from the director of the orphanage where I'd grown up. Her voice was warm and familiar as she said, "Nadine, we received a large donation, enough to hire new staff. Come back. The orphanage will always be your home." I smiled softly but didn't respond. Since I'd escaped, I'd been living in constant fear, afraid that James would somehow find me, or worse, that Sandra would use her family's resources to harm the people I cared about. As long as I stayed hidden, the director and the children would remain safe. Besides, I had grown attached to this quiet town. Perhaps in a few years, 10 at the most, James would forget me entirely and I'd be free to return to the orphanage and live out chapter 6 the rest of my days there in peace. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A month later, on a chilly morning, I was sipping coffee in my tiny kitchen when a notification on my phone caught my attention. The headline read, "Wedding of the Century Crumbles as Groom Disappears. James's shock escape sends Sandra reeling." I blinked, sure I must have read it wrong. I clicked on the article, my stomach twisting as I read further. The wedding of Sandra Wilson and heir James Greaves took a dramatic turn as the groom failed to appear. Sources report a high-profile lawsuit between the Greaves and Wilson families, with secrets unraveling from chapter 6 behind closed doors. 39. Before I could even process the news, I heard the creak of my courtyard gate. I froze, my heart pounding. The gate swung open and there he was, James, standing just a few feet away. "Nadine," he murmured, his voice as familiar as my own heartbeat. I realized, with a chilling certainty, that I'd never been out of his reach. No matter how carefully I'd planned, he had found me. My blood ran cold. I stepped back as he reached for me, but he moved faster, pulling me close, his arms tight around me. My breath hitched, the overwhelming scent of him bringing back every bitter memory, every painful moment. I shoved him away, retreating several steps. MV pulse racing. Chapter 6. "Nadine," he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that left me unsteady. "It's over. Everything's taken care of. We'll never have to be apart again." I stared at him, the words spinning in my mind. "What are you talking about?" I finally managed, a faint tremor in my voice. He took a step closer, his face serious as he spoke. "The Wilson family, Sandra's family, they've been stealing corporate secrets from us. That's why I stayed close to Sandra all this time. She threatened me, Nadine, she would have destroyed everything if I didn't comply." I opened my mouth to argue, but the next words he spoke struck like lightning. "They've collapsed. The Wilson family is chapter 6 ruined. Sandra is she's in prison, Nadine." His voice softened, his expression almost pleading. "I did it all for us, so we could finally be free." I felt the world tilt beneath my feet as his words sank in, each one more absurd than the last. He reached for me again, his eyes filled with a desperate kind of hope. "Come back to me, Nadine. We can finally be together, just us." The chill in the air seeped into my bones. This was James's twisted logic to turn our entire history on its head, to rewrite his cruelty as some kind of sacrifice. He'd torn my life apart piece by piece, and now, with everything he wanted in shambles, he was back to sweep me up like nothing had happened. Chapter 6. I looked at him, at the man I once thought I knew. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, I replied, "I'm not coming back to you, James." He froze, his face paling. "But everything I did, it was to protect you." A bitter laugh escaped me. "Protect me? You stole my freedom, controlled every part of my life, and broke me down, so you could rebuild me as someone who would stay. And now you think a few words will make it right?" Nadine, his voice wavered, but I couldn't bear to hear any more. No, James. My voice strengthened, finally steady. You've taken enough from me. I won't let you take any more. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes, a chapter 6 flicker of something he couldn't control. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I turned away, heart pounding as I walked back into the house, shutting the door on James and every piece of my past he represented. Chapter 7. I froze, rooted in place, as a little girl came bounding out of the hut behind me. With pigtails swinging and a round, mischievous face, she ran straight into my arms, squeezing me tightly and shouting, "Mama." James's expression went rigid. His gaze flickered to the girl, and a storm seemed to brew in his eyes. "Who is this?" he demanded, barely able to keep his voice level. Feeling the warmth of the girl clinging to me, Chapter 7. I quickly snapped back to my senses. "This is my husband's daughter," I said as calmly as I could manage. The lie spilled out before I had a chance to think it through. I told him how I'd met a kind man in town, how we fell in love at first sight, and how, within weeks, we demarried, blending our lives and me accepting the child from his previous marriage as my own. It was a flimsy story, one that any rational person might scoff at, but James stood frozen, his eyes narrowing as he took in the girl's clingy affection and the way she called me Mama. Slowly, his fists clenched, knuckles widening as he fought to keep his emotions from boiling over. Without another word, he gave me a long, piercing look, then turned sharply and left Chapter 7 the courtyard. As the gate clicked shut behind him, the little girl burst into giggles, covering her mouth with both hands like she'd just heard the best joke of her life. "Nadine," she whispered, eyes glinting with mischief, "was that the Uncle James you told the director about?" I laughed, giving her a light tap on the head. "Eavesdropping on my phone calls again, are you? Just wait until I send you back to the orphanage after summer. I'll make sure the director knows you need a lesson in good manners." She stuck her tongue out at me, then scampered off, her laughter trailing behind her like the most innocent melody in the world. STOL. Chapter 7. The next morning, I noticed some activity next door. Workers were hauling furniture and boxes into the small, vacant cottage beside mine. My heart sank as I realized what it meant. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find James standing there, his expression both determined and frustrated. "Where is he?" he asked, his tone more direct than I'd expected. I took a deep breath, deciding it was time to end the farce. "There is no husband, James. I'm not married. And the girl? She's from the orphanage, here for a summer stay." He studied me, his face unreadable, and then nodded slowly. I knew it was a lie. He sounded almost relieved, yet the hope in Chapter 7. His eyes hardened into something much darker. His hand closed over mine, and he stepped closer, voice lowering as he spoke. "Nadine, I came here because I need you to come back with me." My heart clenched at his words and I shook my head, firm but calm. "James, it's over. There's nothing left between us. You can't keep doing this." A flicker of pain crossed his face, but he tightened his grip. "Nothing left. I came here to tell you the truth, to explain everything that happened. I was forced to be with Sandra, to pretend she mattered to you. And now that everything is out in the open, can T protect us, to shield my family, and we just start over." His plea cut through the cold air, and for a Chapter 7 moment, I nearly believed it. But then, every memory surged back, bringing with it the pain, the humiliation, the unbearable moments of being under his control. I forced myself to pull away from him, the ache inside me turning to steel. "Start over," I repeated, barely able to hide the bitterness in my voice. "James, after everything you put me through, do you think that's even possible?" His jaw tensed, the vulnerability in his eyes quickly shifting to frustration. "I didn't put you through anything on purpose. You have to understand I was trying to protect you, Nadine. Sandra and her family." I cut him off, my voice unsteady but resolute. "Protect me? By controlling every inch of my life. By making me feel like a prisoner. Chapter 7. By ignoring what I went through, letting me suffer just to keep up some twisted facade." For the first time, his defiance faltered, his eyes lowering as he seemed to search for an answer. But when he looked up, I could see he was still struggling to see beyond his own sense of righteousness. "I thought you would understand," he said quietly, a wounded look in his eyes. I laughed, shaking my head. "Understand? James, you never put me on equal footing with you. Not once. You kept secrets, used force, all in the name of some protection that I never asked for." I felt my voice rising, but I didn't care. "You talk about love as if it's just about keeping me close, as if that would erase everything I lost, my freedom, my child. Don't try to tell me it was for my Chapter 7 benefit." He paled at my words, the impact hitting him like a blow. Yet, even as his face softened with regret, he stepped forward again, trying one last time. "But I loved you, Nadine. That was real." The weight of everything he'd put me through settled over me like a heavy fog. I looked at him, really looked at him, the man I'd once loved, the man who'd stripped away every piece of me until there was almost nothing left. Your love, I whispered, is something I don't care for anymore. Everything you've done in its name, it's something I don't need in my life. I watched as he struggled to respond, as if the Chapter 7 truth were something any couldn't bear to face. I turned my back to him, feeling the finality of my words sink in. James, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Leave. Don't come back. You took too much from me, and I'm not going to let you take anything more. His silence was the only response. When I turned around, he was gone and the door was shut, closing off the last chapter of our story. Chapter 8. My words had failed to drive James away. Instead of leaving, he dug in his heels, moving his entire operation here. Each day, a steady stream of documents arrived from the city, which he poured over late into the night, then sent back by morning. His Chapter 8 at his worn, tired face, shadows etched beneath his eyes, and murmured, I'll be staying here a while. You should go back. Sandra, who'd once made threats against the orphanage director, was locked away for good. With her gone and with James always nearby, there was no longer a need to run or hide. Beyond that, I couldn't bear to leave the director in his fragile condition, not now. I'd planned on traveling, but that was put on hold. My time here would be spent honoring him and caring for the children. After the many times I'd pushed him away, James seemed to have finally grasped what I wanted. He chose each word carefully, trying to make sure we spoke as equals. I'd like to stay here with you. He hesitated, searching my face. If that's Chapter 8 all right with you? His tone was so sincere and something in his expression so gentle that I barely recognized him. This was a new James, one who spoke and moved like a man unsure of himself, like a man willing to wait for my answer. I gave him a quiet note, as you wish. And so, James fell into a rhythm that became almost second nature. His mornings were spent poring over documents, phone pressed to his ear, while his afternoons were with me, tending to the children. Every so often, I'd catch him in a quiet moment, his gaze fixed on the kids laughing and tumbling in the courtyard, a distant look in his eyes. I could guess what he was thinking, but I Chapter 8 never asked. We both endured our own share of heartbreaks. Some things were better left in silence. One afternoon, as I sat watching the children's play, I felt a tug on my coat. Glancing down, I saw one of the boys from the orphanage, his wide, bright eyes looking up at me in earnest. Nadine, I can't figure out my math homework, he said, holding up a wrinkled sheet covered in numbers and eraser smudges. Smiling, I knelt beside him. Of course. Let's figure it out together, all right. As I talked him through the numbers, the warm sunlight poured through the window, casting a gentle glow across the room. It was Chapter 8, a moment so pure, so full of simple happiness, that I wished it would never end. I wasn't waiting for anything, for anyone, just savoring each second I had. Across the room, James had looked up from his work. He watched me, his expression softened, some of the old tension in his face beginning to fade. For a long time, he simply stared, as though seeing me for the first time. Then, as though some instinct compelled him, he rose and came over. The look in his eyes was full of something quiet and steady, like a man who had finally found his peace. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that maybe, just maybe, I'd found mine too. The end.